So I don't need to introduce this man anymore. Let's get straight into the questions. So, Professor Goldin, you have said before, and I quote, "The future is very unpredictable and only becoming more unpredictable." That's kind of a scary thought for most people, but particularly for those of us in the room trying to write policies or trying to enact policies. So how can we get better at managing uncertainty? How can we help policymakers get better at that?
Yeah, thanks very much. First, why is it becoming more unpredictable, where the only certainty really is surprise? And that's because we're in an increasingly complex dynamic system. There are more and more actors in more and more places, more and more connected. There's more and more genius out there. So expect more Mozart, Shakespeare's, and Einsteins that will change the way we think. But also, we know that change doesn't happen from individuals. It happens from people sparking off each other. And that's happening at warp speed with increasing intensity. More consumption, more production, physical and virtual, in more places. And that's why it's more unpredictable. So what do you do? And how do you advise policymakers in CFG and elsewhere? The first is, I think, to get a sense of what's happening. So what's the time in history we're in? Where's it going? What happens if it's left unchecked? What does this do to citizens? Increasing inequality, increasing instability, increasing shock, desire to create cocoons, more nationalism and protectionism, more downward spiral, growth slows, and there's less ability to manage these collective risks. And that creates a vicious circle. We don't want to end up there. So let's try a virtuous circle, which is what CFG is about. As unpredictable as it is, there's also much greater data and information. So we know much more about climate change than we knew 10 or 20 years ago, and we're learning more every day. We know it's unpredictable. We don't know what the tipping points are, but we do know the trend and what happens if it's left unchecked. So there's absolute certainty on what has to happen, which is we have to keep greenhouse gas emissions as low as possible, as quickly as possible. The only question is, what's the best way of doing that, and how do we agree on it? But that trend is happening, so there's much greater certainty. The same is happening on demographic trends. We know our societies are rapidly aging. Same is happening on economic trends. They're basically known. We know that Europe's going to grow at 1 to 2% for the next 20 years, and Asia's going to grow at 5 to 6% for the next 20 years, and the US is going to grow at 2%. And you can compound that and see what it brings. So there's huge knowledge, despite more unpredictability. And that informs, I think, the decisions that politicians, that the European Union and the CFG have to work on. One thing we also know is that the rate of change of technological progress is accelerating, despite everything that's said against it. And that's going to go further with AI-assisted molecular discovery, etc. So we know that, and we know that unless we do something, we're going to have human cloning, we're going to have human enhancement, we're going to have nuclear missiles at hypersonic speed. We know all these things, and that gives us an agenda to work on.
Yeah, so you mentioned that technology is obviously one of these vectors of unpredictability. Some of it's predictable, perhaps, but what can we learn from previous waves of technological change? This isn't the first time technology has changed society or been set to change society. So what can we learn from the past about the future?
We can mainly learn that we can make big mistakes, and we better be more careful. Being in Europe, I'm always taken by the Renaissance, which was driven by technological innovation, the Gutenberg press. There would be no Renaissance without it. It led to the supercharging of ideas, the creation of that. And then, as now, one of the lessons is that place becomes more important. Although people could read about what was happening everywhere, increasingly in their own languages, the desire to go to Florence was greater as a result, just as it is to dynamic cities today. So the world doesn't become flat, it becomes spikier. place becomes more important as more dynamic people want to be there in these information revolutions. So that's one thing we can learn from the Renaissance. The second thing we can learn is that it creates immense riches and growing inequality. Gold from the New World, spices, furs, fabulous wealth creation, but only the rich were really able to benefit from it. And of course, it also disrupted the old certainties. God was no longer in the heavens. The Catholic Church no longer had a monopoly on truth. The heart was a pump, not a soul. And this led to the bonfire of the vanities. Massive fundamentalist pushback. Savonarola, the Trump of 1495, invented the political pamphlet, invented the popularizing in very short script of ideas that this whole process of change was deeply threatening and unethical, and won the battle. What happened next, of course, was that what had caused the Renaissance, which was diversity, 40% of Florence Muslim and Jew, for example, gay rights, recognized Da Vinci a vegan, that all ended with the Inquisitions. And all diversity was stamped out of Europe. And Europe was set back into new dark ages until the Enlightenment. So we learned that, and we learned that the technologies that were developed allowed other things to happen. 20 million Native Americans were killed by 600 Spanish that arrived. Slavery and everything else that followed. So technology is massively, massively disruptive. Could it have been done differently? I think so, with the wisdom of hindsight. There are lots of other examples of technological breakthroughs. The development of nuclear atomic bombs is another good example. The control of centrifuges, which remains to this day quite successful so far, touch wood, no more nuclear war. But in many cases, we're too late for that. We should have done that with some of the new technologies, which will allow biochemical weapons, etc. But we haven't. But there's lots and lots of examples of successes, and there's lots of examples of failures, and so we need to learn from the success.
You mentioned wisdom there, and it's actually a theme from some of your talks about collective wisdom, collective governance, and how this has to become a central facet of how we manage the world, particularly as complexity increases. We saw earlier from Kim Stanley Robinson extolling the virtues of the EU, no matter how flawed. Is the EU our best current example of collective wisdom, and how can it be improved?
I think, I was glad to hear him say that. I completely agree with him. I think the EU is the most remarkable experiment of the 20th century. The willingness of now 27 countries, and in Schengen 30, to take down borders is really unprecedented, giving up extremely significant things like justice, like defense, like migration policy, like capital movement, to some extent at least. It's being challenged. Someone told me yesterday that there's border controls between Netherlands and Belgium now on people movement, so it's clearly being challenged. But it is an amazing experiment, and that's why we need to make it succeed. But it's also proved to be incredibly successful. It's not just that there won't be another war in Europe. It's that the wealth of Europe, and particularly of Southern Europe, has increased immeasurably. The euro, I also think, is a very successful experiment. I've won many great bottles of wine, taking my friendly competitors in economics on bets that the euro would collapse. And I don't think it will, for lots of good reasons. It's a cooperative solution. Not ideal, but it works. There are other extraordinary examples. We all fly a lot. I don't think any of us stay awake on planes worrying that one plane's going to crash into another in the air. Air traffic control, which has evolved over the last 100 plus years, is just remarkable as a cooperative agreement. The technology today is obviously fundamentally different to what it was even 20 years ago. People speak different languages. They're often at war, not actual war, but conflict with each other. The only reason we don't fly over Russia is because of sanctions, not because we're scared to fly over Russia at the moment, although there have been incidents in the past. It's a wonderful example of technological change and global division being cooperatively resolved, as is, for example, the International Postal Union. The meteorological organization of the UN also works very, very effectively, able to swap information across very different jurisdictions and with very different technologies. Why do they work when the rest of the UN is basically totally unfit for 21st century purpose and getting worse? You certainly wouldn't want to go to the Security Council if you were in Ukraine to try and get a resolution of the conflict. But very little of the UN system works now. And the answer is because no one has an interest in breaking the rule. So the reason that air traffic control works is that it doesn't really make sense for one country to think, well, maybe we should fly in a different air route and see what happens. And the same is true of other things that work. So what we need to look for in cooperative agreements is the win-wins. That's very difficult when you're playing with market forces where some players will make huge amounts of money out of different solutions, or some countries, in the case of climate change, want to keep pumping coal, oil, gas. So you have conflicts of interest, and that's where cooperative solutions become really similar. My own view is that we need to move these down to the lower levels of accountability, and we need to stop thinking about governments as the only actors. The whole UN system, the whole multilateral system, the EU is an intergovernmental organization, and that's a very old-fashioned idea, because increasingly decisions, economic decisions, decisions on technology are made not by governments, but by companies, by cities, by states, by civil society organizations, by professional organizations, and we need to rebalance the debate and get more cooperation, I think, between non-government actors where government actors won't care. We also need to, I think, understand that trying to get everyone to agree everything in a cooperative solution in a world of 212 states is rather utopian. And therefore, working with coalitions of groups of countries that can be first movers in achieving 80% of the outcome with 20% of the players is where we need to go for practical purposes. So how you work in complex systems, I think, becomes a very strategic question.
Yes, and having just come back from the latest COP, that last thing really does resonate. One of the themes, I think, for today, you would have heard it from other speakers and probably also in the workshops, is this focus on anticipation rather than reaction when it comes to governance and policy responses, and particularly at CFG for emerging technologies. So for those people in the room working on technology policy, how can they shift to anticipatory approaches rather than waiting for harms and then figuring out how to deal with those harms?
I think the first thing we need to get our heads around is the precautionary principle. So if we don't regulate or understand much better certain things, what could possibly go wrong? And the answer is everything. So that's not to say that you stop it, but you observe it very carefully and you evolve your regulatory frameworks on the basis of close observation. That can be done in different ways. Clinical trials is a good example of that in medicine, but it can be done by allowing, this is what the Chinese do very effectively. They experiment at the city or municipal level on lots and lots of things, and then they watch it very carefully. And if it works, they scale it. And if it doesn't work, the person running it generally doesn't get promoted. But if they do get promoted, they learn to scale more effectively and they end up back in Beijing after 30 years. That is something that we need to get much better at. But we also need to understand where the trends are going and ask ourselves some deep questions. What really matters? So do we care if humans are cloned? Do we care if some people are enhanced and others are not? Do we care if this is public or private decisions? Do we care if some countries in the European Union do it and others don't? Let's say European Union decides not to do it, but some other country does do it. How do we feel about it? Are we prepared to sprinkle things on our canteen food? Will CFG in its cafeteria put something on the food or in the liquid that will enhance the productivity of CFG by 10%? Give you some bright ideas. If not, why not? These are things that are inevitable. The capacity to do it is inevitable. And yet we are not, even as people thinking about this, really getting our heads around it, let alone society as large and politicians. So we know the direction of travel. We know the capabilities. We don't know whether it's going to be in 5 years or 15 years, but we know we better think about it, talk about it, and get ready for it. And so that's how I think about anticipatory technological change. And the same is happening in multiple other areas. And some of them just arrive very much quicker. And you just wish that you'd had the conversation before. We also need to get better about understanding how we can work with adversaries, because this is a global game. It doesn't really matter if we get completely on top of it in the European Union and other countries go a very different way. So we need to think very carefully about, are we prepared to have conversations about areas which we are convinced are of mutual interest with people that we don't normally like speaking to very much, i.e. China or even Russia. With the US, it's going to be tricky as well, especially over the next 4 years. But it's absolutely essential. And I think there are different ways of doing this. And one of the ways to get politicians to concentrate on the things that we think are important, but they don't, is to surface things in the media. And if the media starts talking about something, oh, do you know that this capability is in the labs, it's coming into the market, and this is what's going to happen, then politicians feel they have to say something intelligent about it. And that's when you can start a conversation. So I don't think, we just target politicians, but we need a broad strategy about raising awareness of these issues as part of the anticipatory process.
It's heartening to hear for the reporters and journalists in the room. There's still a role. AI isn't coming for all those jobs just yet.
Add a footnote. I mean, the crucial thing about media awareness is make sure you get your facts right. Because what one doesn't want is a lot of scare stories. That then the whole information space becomes discredited. And that's why CFG is a serious organization. That's why academics from good institutions are serious things. But there's a lot of secondhand material in what's going to happen with technology. And we saw this with GMOs. We really need to learn that this can go badly wrong and set progress or in a very bad direction, or stop progress if you get it wrong.
Well, perhaps a follow-up to that actually is one of the dangers of technologies is the ability for so many more actors and so many more organizations or individuals to put out information, good or otherwise. I guess what is the way that you see going forward dealing with that information ecosystem when it can be so easily polluted, as you say?
I think that there are different reasons why information gets distorted. One is people who put it out can't tell quality from lack of it. In other words, it's so complicated and so difficult that it's very difficult for non-specialists to discern what's really accurate, what's the state of play. And the whole nature of science, and this is very difficult as well for, I think, people to get their head around. The whole nature of science is proving that the previous scientists were wrong. You build on the lack of understanding and total knowledge of previous generations. That's how it works. And so the idea that you can be the state of the art at any one time, but also say there's lots of things we don't know, needs to be something we get better at understanding. And that's increasingly the case, of course. Having said that, there are lots of brilliant places in very reputable institutions who go through very, very rigorous processes, peer-reviewed journals, etc., to establish whether what they're saying at least has data and evidence which is empirical. And I think we should rely on those. There's some great magazines like Science and Nature that use that sort of information and popularize it, which are very effective. I think we will have debates about how these applications might come, how quickly they might come, what the implications are. But it's not like the information's not there. It is there, changing all the time, but it's there. I also think we need to work with scientists and academics who are very good at saying on the one hand, on the other, which is not what politicians or policymakers want to hear, to be able to articulate the balance of evidence and what one does about it. So I'm very frustrated when I'm being the dean in Oxford with 400 academics on a very topical subject and say, will you go in front of the media and talk about this? And they say, well, I'm not 100%. But they still know more than anyone else could ever know about that subject. But there's a reluctance to expose their lack of knowledge on some marginal issues. And that, I think, is something that scientists need to learn to embrace more effectively. And academics, need to learn to say, on what we know, this is the balance of evidence, even if we're not certain.
I can tell you from personal experience of shepherding the relationship between experts and the media that this is often a cause of frustration from both sides. Let's dive into maybe an example of where a lot of misinformation came from, and also an example of where anticipation failed us. So let's talk about COVID-19. In 2021, you said that we are at a crossroads for humanity, an inflection point in history exacerbated by COVID-19, which was a pandemic brought about by business as usual, basically. Now looking back and maybe projecting forward to future generations, what did we get right in that moment, and what could we improve on?
Let me start with what we got right, which is very much shorter than what we got wrong, unfortunately. What we got right was the ability to develop vaccines at record speed and get them out. Not everywhere, but at least to Europe. That was amazing. And the mRNA vaccine story is quite extraordinary. But also the vaccine we developed in Oxford that took 10 years. Previously, we did it in 9 months. That's what we got right. I think the public health messages were also right, in Europe at least. And we got the recovery plan, the $750 billion, right. What we got wrong, and when I said that, that's what I was worried about, was this going to be a moment in history where we made this the pandemic to end all pandemics, which it could have been. That would have been possible because we realized that one day of the $25 trillion, that's 30% of global GDP, that we lost through the pandemic and the untold lives and misery and still people suffering from long COVID that resulted from it, one day would have been enough money to create a global surveillance system and new technology, have a Manhattan Project sort of exercise to get it, also have SWAT teams and develop vaccine manufacturing facilities to stop future pandemics. But we didn't do that. In fact, the danger of a pandemic now is much greater than it was in 2019 because we got into a blame game. Because the WHO is even weaker today than it was in 2019. And given global tensions between the US and China and with Russia and others, the potential for cooperation is worse. So we'll have much less knowledge and ability to react. And of course, we've shot our fiscal guns. We all indebted. We don't have the firepower to respond in the way we did last time. So we're in a worse situation. It was that crossroads. I really didn't like the language that we heard out of all the actors, the politicians, the World Economic Forum, and everyone else, about jump forward, get back on the road, etc. Some even talked about jumping backwards, because what people need to appreciate is it was the failure to anticipate that brought us there. Everyone who's in public health, which is why I predicted it and did a BBC series on it long before it happened, everyone knew it was going to happen. That's in public health. It's just like a train crash that you know is going to happen. More and more people in more and more places, next to more and more animals, in more unsanitary conditions, near more super spreaders like airports, etc., plus more and more laboratories with more and more synthesizers. You're going to get either a natural or a mistake or a deliberate pandemic. It was inevitable. The only question which no one knew the answer to was where and when, which is why this discussion about Wuhan, the anti-Chinese, is completely useless discussion, which just makes it worse, because it could have come from the richest lab in the US, it could have come from a pig farm in the US, it could have come from anywhere. The question isn't about jumping forward on the same road. We need to change direction rapidly to stop walking off the cliff again. And we're not doing that. So the analogy I would say is that I posed at the time, I now know the answer to. I didn't then. This book was written during the pandemic, and I was doing the BBC work during the pandemic, was, are we in the First World War or the Second World War? So you all know the First World War was a disastrous war, killed over 20 million people. And at the end of the war, there was a desire to not stop wars again. But we know where that went. But through terrible policy and a blame game, impoverishing Germany, Japan, and others. But in the midst of the Second World War, in 1942, literally while the bombs were falling on the Whitehall offices where this was happening, people were cooking up a plan to give Germany money after the war, to give Japan money, the Marshall Plan, to create a new global system of cooperation, the UN, to create a new shared things. And that happened. And of course, where Germany are today and Japan is a reflection of that, giving to your enemy and cooperation, understanding that you needed a different game. And of course, at home, what's even more remarkable to me is that Winston Churchill, 6 weeks after the end of the war, was deposed in the biggest landslide that Labour's ever had, even though he was a war hero. It's sort of unimaginable that he'd won the war and he was kicked out of office. And that was because he wouldn't embrace not only the radicalism of the global effort and 3% of US GDP sent to Germany. Massive sacrifice on the part of people in the US to help the people that were, literally bombing the Allies. But more than that, wouldn't embrace the radicalism at home. So he wouldn't embrace the welfare state and taxes at 70% and other things that were, because parents said, we will not have our kids die again. This really has to change. We're in full employment, housing, education, health. And they got it. That's what that war did, the Second War, and as a result, we haven't had another world war. Again, touch wood. But we're not there. That was the crossroads we were at in 2011, how to turn a crisis into an opportunity. We missed that opportunity, and now the question is, do we need an even worse crisis to wake up, and will we be ready when we have it? One never wants a crisis because it's terrible for people. But if you have a crisis that doesn't create something good, that's even worse. And I fear that's where we are.
Yeah, and in some ways, even though it was so recent, COVID feels very distant as a crisis. We've had too many crises to count since then. It feels like every other week there's a new one. This is making people turn off the TV, turn away from news. It's the era of the poly crisis, as Adam Tooze popularized. How can we get ahead of that next crisis rather than living in reactive mode, right? If we keep jumping from one crisis to the next, what do we do? That's not going to work. So how do you break that cycle, I guess?
Yeah, this is the butterfly defect of globalization. I'm sure everyone knows about the butterfly effect. Lorenz's observation that when a butterfly flaps its wings over the Amazon, it can cause a tornado over Texas. Complex dynamic systems and their interaction and the instability that's generated by it. Globalization, by which I mean flows across national borders of everything, of goods, of services, of people, of ideas, most importantly, of course, of climate impacts, etc., is the result of us living in a world which is irreversible. Only a global catastrophic war will stop this. And it's rising particularly rapidly in Asia. People in Europe think globalization is dead, or in North America. But if you sit in Shanghai or Mumbai or Jakarta or Singapore, it looks very different. Globalization is alive and well and living in Asia. But it's happening here. And it's happening increasingly. We're seeing the underbelly of it. The bads of globalization are traveling more rapidly, as well as the goods. Investment is great, technological flows are great, knowledge is great, and we want more cooperation. That's globalization. But so I don't think we can imagine a world which is somehow stable, where you put flows back in the box, and suddenly you're in a calm, predictable world. I don't think that is something that we'll see again, short of a catastrophic reason for it, like a catastrophic world war. But I think what we can hope for is that we're better at managing these risks. The thing that worries me most is rising nationalism and protectionism, because it's part of a downward spiral. And within that, particularly the rising tension between the US and China. And incidentally, one hears it all the time in Europe as well, increasingly. But it's really the US and China. It's not in anyone's political interests. And there was the only thing that people had bipartisan support for in the US presidential elections was who hates China more and who's going to be tougher on China. But that way, there's going to be rising tension. It's not. I don't think China, I'm giving my own view here, but I don't think China's the source of this. China's made lots of stupid mistakes, and it could reduce the tensions, but this is largely generated by the US loss of hegemony in the world, and its concerns about that. China would be absolutely suicidal to invade Taiwan or escalate tensions greatly in the South China Sea, because China is the principal beneficiary of globalization. It produces 40% of world manufacturers. It needs cooperation on climate and pandemics, as it discovered. It gets it. It's got a technocratic leadership. And so it benefits. But the challenge is, if you have a politics of protectionism, as the US is building, and try and live in a cocoon, you keep out the investment, the people, you build higher tariff walls, but most of all, you keep out the will to cooperate. And so we can only get beyond polycrises if we have more cooperation. Not everyone has to cooperate, but the key players in the world have to cooperate. And the three key players are the US, China, and Europe now. If they don't cooperate, they will be escalating polycrises. If the three of them cooperate, we can manage them down. We can mitigate them. We can reduce some of them. Climate, stop pandemics, stop conflicts, hopefully stop the next financial crisis. There's lots of things that can happen. Of course, Africa and other places matter, but if you look at their potential to create global crises, it's very small in comparison to the big players who account for 80% of the economy and 80% of the problem. There's only one crisis, global crisis, that can come from anywhere on earth, and that's pandemics. And that can come from the poorest village in the poorest country or the richest lab in the richest country. That's the only thing that threatens us that could create a global systemic collapse which is why the COVID-19 was so important and such a lost opportunity. But every other crisis that we think about, well, I can't think of a major systemic crisis that could come from a poor African country, for example. But I can think of lots of crises that can come from the US, China, or Europe. And that's what we need to worry about. Of course, there's some rogue players like North Korea, but they won't be managed unless China and the US get their act together. And so that is the absolutely central relationship. So that's how we get ahead of polycrises. We try and get the US and China to cooperate. What Europe does in this, and whether Europe can be a bridge or whether Europe takes sides, is absolutely central to this question. I believe we have to be a bridge. We cannot take sides, but there's lots of pressure, as we saw with Huawei and what happened with Huawei. There's lots of pressure to take sides. And of course, Europe's not united either. Ukraine is extremely important as well, actively engaged with it in the reconstruction plan. If you don't draw lines and say what's acceptable in a civilized world, you are contributing to a race to the bottom. And that's why I believe it's really something that Europe is going to have to, and it's going to be a big challenge because it's going to eat into our budgets, amongst other things, in the coming years. But we have to be very clear about Ukraine as part of this as well.
Okay, so polycrises, accelerating technologies, pandemics coming from anywhere and everywhere. It's a very optimistic worldview that we've been presenting here today. I often flippantly describe my work as working on the scariest emerging technologies, but that's not exactly right. We work on technologies that we think could have upsides as well as downsides, otherwise we wouldn't work on them. So I always like to ask people this, and I think we'll end here. What makes you hopeful about the next few decades?
I'm hopeful for a number of reasons. Let's start with CFG. There's more and more people that get it, that are working on it, that are putting thought into this, that want to be in front of it and help politicians, the media, and others get in front of it. And I think, particularly in Europe and where we're sitting today, this is really feasible. There's no technical or other reason why Europe can't get in front of this. And if Europe does, it's such a big player in the world and such a big market in the world that I think there will be convergence, or at least for tradable goods like medical apparatus and things across the line. And Europe, I think, could do a lot. So I'm hopeful about that. A lot of people are very gloomy about Europe, but I think this is an area, and CFG will play a part in that. I'm hopeful because I know too many people that have died of cancer, that suffer from terrible diseases, which I'm very optimistic, not all of them, and not all variations of cancer, but that there will be extraordinary progress, that we'll have more progress in medicine over the next 10 years than we've had over the last 100. Because of what, AI, augmentation of capacity, molecular discovery of drugs, synthesizing human genome fully, individualized medicine, and including with 3D printing, additive manufacturing. This is amazing, absolutely amazing. Of course, we need to ensure that everyone benefits, not just the few that can afford private medicine. So when you reach my age, you begin to think about neurodegeneration as well. I think where we're at today is there's like a 20-30 growing gap between physical and mental longevity advances. And so that's a worry, that we'll have a lot of people around who are physically present but not mentally capable. But what I'm beginning to pick up on neurodegenerative medicine, and I know there's someone outside there helping us, we're getting our brainwaves, is also very exciting. I think it's a little bit further away, so when you're my age, you wonder, is it going to be in time or not? But you don't have to worry, Rowan. You'll be absolutely fine, and anyone young in the room. You just don't have to worry about this. And that is just incredible. The productivity improvements in certain sectors, we have a real productivity problem in our economies. Productivity growth is low. Solo's adage that we see computers everywhere except in the growth statistics or the productivity statistics is absolutely right. But as we get greater impact in the parts of the economy that can be susceptible in the near term to AI and robotics, we're going to see incredible things as well. And what we're discovering on energy as well. I still think that fusion, as always, is 10 years away. But what's happening on solar is just extraordinary. The capacity China now is producing. What's happening on EVs is mind-boggling. Really mind-boggling. More production a year than in all of history. This is something. And bringing down the price of energy to 10 cents a kilowatt hour, we're moving very rapidly to a world of free energy. That changes everything, and it doesn't make air conditioning the worry it is now. It becomes very, very, very powerful. So there's lots of reasons to be optimistic. There's more genius in the world, as I mentioned, and this genius can be bad. But there's also going to be more creativity and more wonderful experiences and upside surprises. That makes me optimistic. So, yeah, I do think we're in a renaissance moment in history. And the question really is, will the outcome be better than the Renaissance of 500 years ago? And it's up to organizations like CFG and the people here to be agents in ensuring it is.
Thank you very much. Can we have a round of applause for Ian, please?